You know, um, we spend almost our entire lives trying to compress our massive, complicated inner worlds into these tiny little delivery vehicles.
Right, like text messages or quick emails.
Exactly. Or, maybe a rush 5-minute catch-up over coffee.
Mm.
We have decades of lived experience, nuanced emotions, complex thoughts, and we're trying to force all of that data through the narrowest possible channels.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate bottleneck of human existence.
It is.
Yeah.
And most of the time, it feels like the signal just degrades. Like we push the information out, but we don't quite get through.
You can think of it like trying to stream a massive, uncompressed, high-definition 4K movie over a decades-old dial-up internet connection.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, because there's an immense amount of data, every subtle shade of feeling, every piece of contextual history. But the bandwidth of our standard day-to-day communication is incredibly limited.
So you inevitably end up with a pixelated buffering version of what you actually mean to say. But then, for you listening, think about those incredibly rare moments where the bandwidth limit just vanishes entirely. You look at someone across a crowded room, or they make a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture with their hand, and suddenly that entire 4K movie downloads into your brain in a fraction of a second.
It's wild when that happens.
It is. You don't need a single word to explain yourself. They just know. You just know.
That is basically the highest possible definition of human connection. I mean, the complete and total elimination of friction between two minds.
Right, and that brings us to our deep dive for today. In September of 2012, an author named Shufeng wrote a remarkably short text, which was translated and edited by Kinyu.
Very short, barely a paragraph long.
Barely a paragraph, yeah. And it attempts to map out exactly how this highest definition connection actually functions. The piece is called Spiritual Communion.
And despite its length, it is this hyper-concentrated blueprint of the phenomenon.
So our mission for you today in this deep dive is to slow that text way down. We are going to decode the intense imagery Yufeng uses and figure out the actual mechanics of what it means to completely merge your internal world with someone else's.
And what's fascinating here is how the text structure itself actually mirrors that journey.
How so?
Well, it starts from a tiny physical action and then expands outward into a state where time and space completely dissolve. But to understand the mechanics, we really have to start with the prerequisite.
Right, the baseline.
Exactly. The text opens with a very specific condition. It says, when hearts are in tune.
I love that it starts there. It doesn't start with a grand theatrical declaration of love or anything.
No, not at all. It starts with an established alignment. And once that baseline is set, Xu Meng lists out the specific triggers that activate the connection.
And they're really subtle, right?
Incredibly subtle. A single glance, a gesture, an expression, a movement, or a word.
Okay, let's unpack this because those triggers are so incredibly small. For you listening, think about it like finding a hidden frequency on an old analog radio dial.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you're slowly turning the knob, hearing nothing but static. Static. You don't even know if the radio works.
Right.
And then click. You hit the exact right millimeter, the static instantly clears, and a crystal clear symphony pours out.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Or, to use a more modern mechanical analogy, it's like entering a single, simple keystroke on a computer.
And that one keystroke suddenly unlocks and boots up a massive, infinite operating system that was sitting completely dormant just a second before.
Exactly. And the text actually describes this exact feeling, saying these tiny movements open a door as beautiful and infinite as poetry and painting.
The operating system analogy perfectly illustrates the why behind this opening concept. Zhifeng is making a radical argument about where profound connection actually lives.
Right. It's not in the big grand gestures.
No, it doesn't require standing outside a window with a boombox or, writing a 10-page letter. The most infinite connections are unlocked by the most subtle, everyday human micro-expressions.
Because we are constantly scanning the people around us, right?
Constantly. Reading thousands of subconscious data points a second. Pupil dilation, muscle tension, posture. But if that prerequisite, the heart's in tune part, isn't met, a glance is just a glance.
Just visual data.
Exactly. It's just data. But when the alignment is there, your brain recognizes that single glance as a decryption key. It unlocks that infinite door.
It's almost like an inside joke, but instead of just sharing a laugh, you are sharing an entire reality.
A shared reality, yes.
And once that infinite door is opened by that simple glance, the text takes us straight into the environment that this connection creates.
Right, it drops us into these incredibly lush, vivid landscapes.
Yeah, we get flower gardens under the moonlight by the streams and the hills and the valleys inside the caves. And in these spaces, Yu Feng writes that the heart blooms with wonder everywhere.
It is a really striking shift. We go from the physical body, a glance or a gesture, to a sprawling environment.
And the text goes on to describe a state with no obstacles, no barriers, no worries, no restraints, allowing a person to follow their hearts and freely display their grace and charm.
Which sounds idyllic.
It does, but this is where I have to pause and ask a clarifying question, because my immediate reaction to reading about streams and caves was a bit literal.
Okay, literal in what way?
Like, is the author implying that true spiritual communion requires physically escaping society?
Mm.
Do two people need to, pack their bags, leave the noisy city, and hike out to a moonlit valley to actually experience this level of unbothered connection?
I see what you mean.
Or are these serene, isolated landscapes serving as a metaphor for a specific psychological state?
Well, the literal interpretation is tempting because obviously a quiet garden certainly helps.
Sure, peace and quiet is nice.
But the synthesis of the text strongly points to these physical landscapes representing a pure, untainted internal environment.
Okay, an internal environment.
Right. When you achieve this level of communion with another person, your internal psychological world becomes just as serene and warm as that moonlit garden.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Think about the specific imagery of the cave, for instance. A cave represents shelter. It is an enclosure that protects you from the harsh elements outside.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes so much sense.
So when the text talks about having no obstacles, no restraints, and being able to freely display their grace and charm, it is describing the ultimate state of psychological safety.
This makes total sense.
Mm.
Because in our normal day-to-day lives, we are constantly expending cognitive energy on self-monitoring.
Constantly.
We are constantly projecting an avatar of ourselves, running a background program of threat detection. Like, did I say the right thing? How is this person judging me? Do I need to be defensive?
And that self-monitoring is exhausting.
It really is. So the cave isn't a physical place you go to hide. It's the profound safety you feel with that specific person, where you can finally turn that threat detection program off.
Precisely. And when you turn off the threat detection program, you reclaim all of that wasted cognitive energy.
Which is why the text says the heart blooms with wonder.
Exactly. You no longer have to build defensive walls. Your authentic self can simply exist and expand without fear of judgment. You are shielded by the connection itself.
But, psychological safety is incredibly easy to maintain when everything around you is perfect.
Sure was no stress.
Right. It's easy to feel totally vulnerable and untainted when you're resting in a metaphorical moonlit garden. The real test of any connection is what happens when that environment becomes hostile.
And the text doesn't let us stay comfortable for very long.
No, it doesn't. It immediately throws this bond into some incredibly harsh conditions to test its durability.
The introduction of real-world friction.
Yeah, the environment violently shifts. We move from the cozy garden to the ends of the earth, across mountains and rivers, no matter how high the mountains or how vast the waters.
It even throws us into dense fog and mist.
Right. But despite all of that extreme physical separation and disorientation, the text insists the bond remains as close as glue. The hearts and souls remain completely intertwined.
And the emotional resilience described here is staggering.
It really is. Even in that dense fog, the text claims there are no grievances, no sadness, no troubles, no hesitation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the high mountains and vast waters clearly represent literal physical distance between two people. But the dense fog and mist is really the crucial element here.
Because it represents confusion.
Exactly. Fog is a universal symbol for emotional confusion. It represents the times in a relationship where you lose your bearings, where the intent of the other person is suddenly obscured, and you can't clearly see the path ahead.
Which happens in every relationship.
It does. And in ordinary relationships, what happens when intent is obscured?
We assume the worst. Distance and confusion are the breeding grounds for resentment. If there's a gap in information, if we don't know what the other person is thinking or why they are pulling away, our brains naturally fill that gap with anxieties and grievances.
But the text is arguing that true spiritual communion fundamentally alters that psychological default setting.
How so?
It acts as an impenetrable shield against both physical distance and emotional friction. Because you have already established that profound baseline of safety in the cave we talked about, the dense fog no longer triggers your threat response.
Oh, so you don't panic just because you can't see them.
Right. You don't start doubting the connection just because you can't see the other person clearly in that moment. The communion provides an absolute benefit of the doubt. It is completely immune to the typical decay that destroys ordinary human connections.
Immune to decay. That paints a picture of this unshakable, bulletproof calm. You're glued together, totally unbothered by the fog or the mountains.
It's a very peaceful image.
But just as we settle into this idea of passive, untouchable peace, the text pivots again. And this is probably the most conceptually difficult part of the entire piece.
Oh, definitely.
Because spiritual communion is not just passive peace, it is also explosive, chaotic energy.
It forces the reader to reconcile two completely opposite states of being happening at the exact same time.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me read this juxtaposition because it is wild.
Go for it.
On one hand, the text says that in this state, you can quietly observe the rising and falling tides, the swirling clouds, and the magical combinations and performances of countless things.
Which sounds very detached, very zen.
Right. But literally in the next breath, it says you can instantly merge into a roaring fire and stir up tumultuous waves.
That's a dramatic shift.
For you listening, imagine standing in the dead center of a hurricane. It's like the text is saying, spiritual communion is the ability to stand in the perfectly still, quiet eye of the storm, but also be the violent, crashing eyewall of the storm at the exact same time.
The specific vocabulary the author uses to resolve this paradox is vital here. Right after the roaring fire, the text mentions savoring the realms where yin and yang meet, where heaven and earth connect.
Okay, yin and yang.
Right, this is the underlying mechanism of the connection. In Eastern philosophy, yin and yang are not opposing forces that cancel each other out. They are complementary forces that create a dynamic whole.
We so often think of a peaceful relationship as one where nobody ever raises their voice. We equate peace with a total lack of conflict.
Which isn't very realistic.
Exactly. But this text is arguing something much deeper. True peace isn't the absence of the roaring fire. It is the capacity to endure that fire without the connection breaking. If your connection is just quiet observation, it's stagnant, it's fragile.
A connection that can only survive in perfect stillness isn't true communion. Spiritual communion encompasses the entirety of the human experience.
The whole spectrum.
Yes, it requires the calm, receptive, observing earth of the yin, where you can quietly watch the magical combinations of life unfold. But it also requires the active, passionate, chaotic heaven, the yang.
Because the text mentions shifting reins, passionate embraces, and intimate union.
Exactly. You need both to have that dynamic whole.
So you are so fundamentally secure in the bond that you can swing seamlessly from the quietest, most passive observation of the universe to the most chaotic, fiery engagement with it.
Yes, without fear.
You can have a massive, tumultuous waves of conflict or passion. And it doesn't threaten the foundation of the relationship. It's a resilient, breathing ecosystem.
And having merged that quiet observation with that chaotic fire, the text pushes the reader toward the final, ultimate conclusion of this connection. We move past the physical environment, past the emotional friction, and arrive at a point where reality itself begins to dissolve.
Yeah, we hit escape velocity here. The climax of the piece reads, following the flow of life, carefree and at ease, where space disappears, time ceases to exist, and only the spirit shines, the soul drifts.
It really leaves the physical world behind entirely.
It goes on to describe a state of endless bliss that actually overrides our basic biology. It says you are free from thirst and hunger without weariness or fatigue.
The physical limitations of the human condition are entirely stripped away.
It is incredible to look at the progression we just walked through.
Yeah.
I mean, we started this deep dive talking about a simple human glance, a tiny micro-expression.
And now, just a few sentences later, we are exploring a state where space and time are literally gone, and the human body no longer needs to eat or sleep.
So what does this all mean? How do we ground this? Is Weifeng describing literal magic, or is there a psychological reality to this?
There is actually a very documented psychological reality to this, which is often referred to in cognitive science as a flow state.
Oh, like an athlete or a musician who is so deeply engaged in their performance that they completely lose track of time and don't even feel the blisters forming on their hands.
Precisely. In a flow state, your brain is so entirely consumed by the present task that it literally stops processing peripheral data.
Wait, really? It just stops?
Yeah, the signals for hunger, fatigue, or the passage of time are simply not granted cognitive bandwidth. What this text is arguing is that profound human connection can trigger that exact same state. The gravity of a truly untainted spiritual bond is so massive that it warps your perception of time and space. You can sit in a diner booth with someone, fall into this level of communion, and suddenly it's 3 in the morning.
And you haven't eaten, you haven't slept, but you feel completely energized.
Exactly. The connection becomes the only reality that matters.
Everything else, even the biological imperatives of the human body, just fades into the background noise.
It really does.
The text concludes by admitting this state is beyond words and indescribable joy. It's an acknowledgement that human language will always be an imperfect delivery vehicle for this kind of depth.
Right, going back to our dial-up analogy.
Yeah. Yet, by moving through these specific stages, Sue Feng manages to give the ineffable a very tangible architecture.
It takes something we often dismiss as just a fleeting feeling and treats it as a structured, achievable state of being.
So let's bring this all back down to earth and summarize exactly what we've unpacked for you today. This short text from 2012 provides a complete mechanical blueprint for ultimate human connection.
It reminds us that spiritual communion doesn't require grand orchestrations.
Right. It starts with the smallest possible data transfer, a gesture or a glance, provided your internal frequencies are aligned.
And from that tiny spark, it builds an internal environment of absolute psychological safety, where the exhausting work of self-monitoring can finally stop.
Which provides an emotional shield that allows you to give the benefit of the doubt, completely neutralizing the resentment and confusion that usually come from physical distance.
It redefines peace not as the absence of conflict, but as the bandwidth to hold both quiet observation and chaotic fiery passion without breaking.
And ultimately, it has the sheer power to pull us into a profound flow state, freeing us, even if just for a few hours in a diner booth, from the heavy, exhausting constraints of time, space, and our own physical biology. It is a stunning vision of the absolute limit of what human empathy can achieve.
It does leave us with one final, lingering thought to explore, though. Something derived directly from that climax where time and space disappear.
That's that.
Well, if the ultimate logical destination of the spiritual communion is a state where the physical world completely ceases to exist, and where you no longer feel basic human limitations like thirst or fatigue,
Right.
is the author describing a perfect, fleeting state we can achieve right here in our daily lives? Or is this text actually a beautifully disguised description of a connection that can only truly be realized once we have left our physical bodies behind entirely?
Oh, wow. Does the ultimate connection require us to abandon the delivery vehicle altogether? That is a fascinating thought for you to carry with you today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking for those hidden frequencies, trust the gravity of those connections, and we hope you find those rare moments where the static finally clears.